Several events occurred in the last week which kind of crisscrossed in my mind vis-a-vis this passage. And I am sure that at least one of them you are well aware of. The big event that took place that was on the news right here was the pictures we saw from Pluto. Did you see those? Were those just absolutely stunning? The fact that that satellite's been traveling, 10 years and millions of miles, and the pictures and the things revealed, the ravine and the heart shape on the side and the snow-capped mountains, and the satellite will go on. And as I watched that, I thought it wasn't just amazing to see this decade-long journey that had taken place, but in some respects for me, it represented a half-century journey since John Kennedy first said, we need to go into space. Do you remember that? Do you remember how inspiring that was for a generation that we need to, before the end of this decade, put someone on the moon? And all the things that have happened because of that inspiring moment that challenged a generation and a nation. You know, your laptop computer has more power than all the computers that put Neil Armstrong on the moon, and I dare say your smartphone might be pretty close to that. I get in some people's cars and I think I'm going to the moon when they push all the buttons and they flash. Anyway, that was one thing that struck me this week. And over here was something else that some of you may have seen, may not have seen, but I watched last Sunday Wimbledon. I haven't watched Wimbledon in years and very much enjoyed the match, but prior to the match, they interviewed Roger Federer, the number 2 tennis player in the world, as he prepared to play Novak Djokovic, the number 1 player who he's not had much luck against lately. And they, reporters trying to be really cute and keen, they said, what's your strategy? What's your strategy for beating him? And Roger Federer said 2 words: just believe. Now, those 2 things may seem quite a dichotomy and literally millions and millions of miles apart, but in my mind, they came together because they share a very distinct element, an element that we sometimes overlook, forget, and I think maybe in our day and age have somewhat lost. And that's that notion of to believe. To have faith, faith that you can defy the impossible, that you can dream big, that you can achieve things that nobody has even thought of yet, that there are possibilities beyond human knowledge and our present ken that could happen if we dared to step out and move beyond ourselves. Qualities that people have always had. It's almost in our DNA to think and to believe and to challenge and to inspire one another. And anytime anything great has ever happened in history, someone else called it ridiculous, ludicrous, and unachievable. And yet I dare say that it is a part of our creative spirit. It is in the DNA of our soul. I mean, it's as simple as whenever we watch sporting events, we long for the underdog who comes out of the blue, the horse that nobody thinks can win, and we cheer for that person. We love David and Goliath stories. It is intrinsically part of us. But as Roger Federer reminded me, there's not even the possibility of this happening if you do not believe. Is it not the start that stops most of us? And it seems to me that maybe the biggest gift that Jesus gave his disciples is that. I mean, some might say, well, his biggest gift is to believe in God, but I dare say they believed in God. Most people in the ancient world had some idea of a deity. Their whole world evolved around some understanding of God. He didn't give them that. And maybe even, the notion that they were to believe in him. They came to that as well. They came to recognize and understand that. But what they really had trouble in, again and again and again, they had trouble believing in themselves. They had trouble believing that they had the ability to do things with him that were unimaginable. that they could overcome their personal doubts, conquer their deepest fears, learn the strengths that they had even in the face of their weaknesses, that they could be a force of God and the face of Christ in the world. It is in John's gospel, and I'm always kind of challenged by it. It is in John's gospel that Jesus looks at the disciples before he departs, before he ascends to heaven. Jesus says to them, "If you trust, you will do greater things than me." Come on, really? If you trust, he says, you will do greater things than me. We have trouble believing that, and yet the rudiments, the seeds of this are so clearly illustrated in the feeding of this 5,000. They say, "Jesus, look at the crowd, they need to be fed." And he says, "Well, feed them, take care of it." Right? And they said, stops most people, says, "We don't have it. We can't do it. We don't have enough. It would take a fortune." Jesus says, "What do you got? What do you got?" And when they offer it, and when they work together, when they are in partnership, it's not Jesus fixing it for them. It's not Jesus doing it to them or to the people. It's just saying, let's in partnership together, when we work on this, let's just see what happens. Don't you see, it's not only done with him, it's done through them. But not without them first overcoming the inhibitions that it could happen at all. Somehow, they had to step out and step beyond their doubts and trust that 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 could equal 5,000. They had to believe and then act upon their belief. And it makes me think how many times in our individual and in our corporate lives we are our own worst enemies. We are our own worst enemies. That we come up with great schemes and great ideas, and then we are afraid to take that step. I mean, haven't we all been at a meeting or been at some place where somebody says, "Well, I have an idea," and they share it, and everybody had the first reaction was, "Well, that's really cool," and then the second reaction is, "Well, let's pick it apart. Let's talk about how it can't happen." And what do we call that? To make it we put a positive spin on that criticism. What do we call it? I'm playing the devil's advocate. Doesn't that say it all? I mean, seriously, doesn't that say it all? I'm playing the devil's advocate. I'm going to tell you why it won't work so that you won't fail. I go to the store sometimes at the kiosk before you check out, or I watch Shark Tank and the ridiculous things that people present and these guys invest in and then make a fortune. And I say to myself, why didn't I think of that? Which is a really good question. Why don't we? What limits us? How do we inhibit ourselves from dreaming and dreaming big and dreaming the dreams that God would place in our hearts? Stephen Hawking, the brilliant scientist of our time, said this past week, it was in multiple papers, he said that the world is heading for global disaster. He said by 2030. That's not very far off. And he listed climate change, poor water usage, poor food production, carbon emissions, and he didn't even start talking about global war. I think we all watch the weather, don't we, and think, what's going on? I mean, seriously, something, right? And it's easy for all of us to kind of get sucked into that attitude that says, well, I'm going to be dead before that arrives anyway, or I can't do anything to change it, or we just kind of throw our hands up, and yet we are reminded here that 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 can make a difference. It can change things. Miracles happen. It's just that, as another famous scientist said, Albert Einstein, he said long ago, you can't solve the same old problems with the same old solutions. Or something to that effect. And we have to lift the blinders, and we have to trust, and we have to dare, and we have to take risks, inspiring and challenging one another again. Jesus said, "Greater things than I have done you can do, you should do, you must do." The challenge is, do we believe that we can? You know, that's the real crux of this story with the disciples. Do you believe that what you have, the gifts, the skills, the abilities in partnership with God can make a difference? You know, at Easter time, it gnawed on me greatly as I watched our Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East, in Syria and in Iraq, fleeing ISIS. You know, we talked about that, and it troubled me so much. I said, well, we got to do something about it. And I said, you know, through the Assyrio group, and I will share all the notes of gratitude that we have received from those people. It's been pretty profound. But I you know, kind of woke up in the middle of the night and I said, well, we should give, you know, $10,000 will do this much for those refugees and help them in this way. And then I started to think about it and I said, man, you don't think big enough. 2,500 people on Easter at $10 a person is $25,000. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So I, being conservative and having a personal fear of failure, you know, I lowered the goal to 20,000, and the congregation did 25. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 people, excluding women and children. You do the math. It doesn't make sense, it doesn't add up, but that's what occurred when the disciples moved beyond their doubts and just believed. Now, if you want, I can end the sermon there. Or I can explain the title and the picture on the front of your bulletin. Let's take a vote. Being a Westerner at heart and having grown up on the Oregon Trail, I know some of these things. And as I was thinking about it, I was reminded of the phrase used by pioneers 100 and some years ago called "seeing the elephant." When people would leave the East, they'd leave Pennsylvania, they'd sell all they had, and they'd go to St. Joseph, Missouri, and they'd buy a wagon, and they'd get 3 mules, and they'd load it all up. People said, "You are nuts. Where are you going? It's dangerous out there. That's a desert. That's prairie. There's Indians. There's cold weather. That's nuts. Why are you doing this?" And they said, "We're going to see the elephant. Going to see the elephant." Which doesn't make any sense, does it? And yet it made all the sense in the world to them. We are going to see something we have never seen. We are going to dream about going someplace we have never gone before. We're going to be a part of something. We're going to make it happen. We're going to go there. We're going to see the elephant. It made no sense, and yet it makes all kinds of sense. And isn't that the sense of spirit, that sense of seeking, discovering, risk-taking, commitment? Isn't that what new life in Christ is about? Dreaming the dream, believing in something other than the world we see, seeing the elephant. Isn't that what Christ is about? Isn't that what our future and our age needs to be about again? Just believe. Amen.